Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the HACCP 2020 updates. My name's Freddie and I'm just going to run through a little bit of the housekeeping before I hand you over to our presenter. If you'd all like to just make sure that you've got your browsers and any open apps closed, just so that your internet can run okay, and set the volume to a nice level so you can hear the presenters. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, if you just want to message me in the chat box, I'll be able to sort those out for you. We do have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so any questions, please send them over, and then we'll do those live. And finally, a copy of the slides and the webinar will be available from next week onwards, so I'll make sure that this is all sent out to you. And if there's any questions that we can't answer, we'll send those answers out individually. So now I'll hand you over to Caroline, who is our presenter.
Thank you, Freddie. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Codex 2020 HACCP updates. Before we sort of jump into the presentation this morning, I just thought I'd give you a quick introduction of myself. So my name is Caroline Goodburn, and I am a food tutor for SGS. Prior to joining SGS, I spent some 25 years in food manufacture in both the UK and Europe, where I was supplying both retailers and food service customers alike, producing both own label and branded products. During that time, I worked with a number of product areas, including ambient bakery, ready meals, ready-to-eat produce, crisps and snacks, sandwiches, savoury pastry products, and sous vide and retort meat products. So I think it'd probably be fair to say that I'm absolutely passionate about food safety, given my exposure during my career. And my areas of interest are around international food safety management systems, food hygiene, food microbiology, and process validation. Next slide, please. Okay, so the agenda for this morning, we're going to cover the following. We're going to look at the background to HACCP and the updated version. We're going to look at the restructure within the Codex framework. I'm going to summarise the main changes and go through management commitment, food safety culture, the Codex decision tree, good hygiene practices, and the main changes to HACCP that are now sitting in chapter 2. And then I'm going to go through allergen management, and then finally go through on the Q&A, as Freddie's just mentioned. So, as I've just said, I've worked with HACCP for many, many years throughout in my career across many, many sectors. And in that time, the Codex general principles for food hygiene have been central to my work, along with the GFSI standards. HACCP, as you will be aware, is not a new concept, but it is an internationally recognised framework for the management of food safety. The Codex principles themselves have been with us for quite a while, and they've been with us since 1969. Back in 1969, these texts provided the basic principles for food hygiene that was applicable throughout the food chain, so from the primary producer right through to the consumer. And the sole aim of this text was around making food safe. And it recommended the use of HACCP as a means of improving food safety. And today, many of the norms and standards and regulations that we work to have got the Codex principles incorporated them in part or in full. So I think we can really sort of say from its basis back in 1969 that the Codex principles have been in part responsible for the global acceptance of HACCP, and it's been important in the development of food safety management. So last year, the Codex principles were published, and like most things in 2020, they too were delayed due to COVID. But prior to this update, there have been a number of revisions since 1969, and the last revision of the Codex guidelines was in 2003. So I think we can probably say they're a little bit overdue for a review, because since 2003, our approach to food safety management has undergone a number of changes, with the introduction of ISO 22000 in 2005 and the more recent update in 2018. We've also had the Food Safety Modernisation Act, which has introduced the preventative controls. We've also had a number of updates in our GFSI standards. So today, I think we can say from the way food safety has moved on from 2003, there is a more risk-based approach to food safety management. And more recently, the scope of that risk-based approach has been widened to include prevention of malicious acts and food fraud. And this is really supported by the reinforcement of that food safety culture. So prior to this new version being adopted in 2020, the requirements for HACCP were laid down in a separate annex within Codex, but in this 2020 revision, HACCP now has its own chapter. And I think this really highlights the importance of HACCP in managing food safety. Next slide, please. So we can see on this slide here, there is the structure of the HACCP sort of laid out in front of us. And it covers the introduction. This gives the context of the document and sort of gives an outline of what the document entails. In the objective, it provides guidance on the application of good hygiene practices and HACCP and the relationship between good hygiene practices and HACCP. The scope details the sectors in the food chain where the framework can be applied. And in this case, it very much is around a field to fork approach. The use, it gives general detail of the intent for the use, so it's intended to be used by food business operators, but it also talks about the roles of competent authorities and food business operators, and also brings in consumers. In general principles, we have management commitment to food safety, where it is actually recognising for the first time the importance of a food safety culture and what management need to do to demonstrate this. Definitions, as we go through the presentation, we'll see there's been some amendments in some definitions and also some updates, and we'll talk about those in a little while. Chapter 1 gives us a good in-depth overview of all the good hygiene practices, and there have been a number of changes in there and a lot more detail has been put in there. And chapter 2 describes the HACCP guidelines and how it should be applied. So in there, the preparatory steps and the HACCP principles themselves, there have been some changes in the wording, which we'll talk about as well. And lastly, within the additional annexes, there are some diagrams showing examples of control measures. It gives an example of a HACCP worksheet, and it also gives us a sequence for the application of HACCP. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I've just sort of gone through what the main changes really are. So please be aware that not all changes are listed here, and I can't go through all changes in the document because of the time frame that we have today. So first of all, when we're talking about management commitment to food safety, this has been added as a section in the introduction, and the management responsibilities for the effectiveness of the food safety management system and hygiene system are outlined in there. Within that section as well, it talks about food safety culture, and the food business operator must build a positive food safety culture. And this is done by demonstrating their commitment to providing safe and suitable food and encouraging appropriate food safety practices. And the elements in this building of a positive food safety culture are outlined within the document itself. The Codex decision tree, which I think we've probably all worked with for a number of years, this has actually been removed from this document at this time. And it's thought to be updated at some point and then added in at a later date. And lastly, allergen management. So there is a new requirement to control allergens in addition to physical, chemical and biological hazards. So whilst there are references to this in the new standard for allergen management, and I will talk about these in a little bit more detail as we go through the presentation this morning, the requirements for allergen management are referred to in a standalone code of practice called Food Allergen Management for Food Business Operators, and the code of that is CXC 334-20. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we have mentioned that there is a different structure covering the good hygiene practices and the HACCP systems in chapters 1 and 2. But there are in addition some adjusted and different requirements which we'll talk about shortly from the 2003 version, such as validation and control measures. Minor updates include practices which are now common in place within the food industry. So many of us who are working with GFSI standards might be very familiar with some of these practices already, such as traceability, verification of cleaning programs, allergen management and the prevention of cross-contamination. And all of that is supported through a strong emphasis on training. So Codex really sort of set out to undertake this update, and really what they've sort of said that the aim of the update is to provide a common ground for food safety worldwide and to form the basis of all other Codex food texts. And it's really intended that it can be adopted by food business operators of all sizes, and has laid down provisions within that framework for flexibility. So we're now in time to walk through some of these updates. Next slide, please. So starting with food safety culture. So the need for a well-maintained food safety management system is long established. The new Codex requirements recognise this through both management commitment and the requirement to develop that food safety culture. So as I've sort of said, those of you who have implemented some of the GFSI standards will be very familiar and probably very, very comfortable with this requirement. But Codex now recognises that food safety culture is important in developing positive behaviour that can impact on how food safety is implemented and maintained within that business. So the requirement for senior management commitment is clearly defined, and it acknowledges that a successful food safety management system is dependent on that positive food safety behaviour. And senior management need to set the direction and engage all people who are working in the organisation in those food safety practices. And this is all about defining the food safety policy and those procedures. There is a real need for open and clear communication within this framework, and all personnel within the food businesses must have clear communication. And the particular emphasis within the framework is about communication of deviations, with roles and responsibilities clearly defined for when there is a deviation within the process. It is expected that resources are available to ensure that the sufficient functioning of the food business to support that, along with appropriate training and education and supervision in place. But the emphasis here has sort of shifted a little bit on the training, where there's more an emphasis now on competence rather than just delivering the training or just telling people or showing people. Visible management support is at the core of the maintenance of that food safety culture. And lastly, to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and encouragement of that continued improvement and taking into account of scientific developments and changes out in the business arena. This is all done through monitoring and feedback. Next slide, please. So as I've said earlier, the Codex decision tree has been removed and no alternative has been included at this stage. The Codex Commission has said that work on the decision tree to identify critical control points will continue in the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, so that once it's completed, it can be included into the general principles of food hygiene as an annex. So hopefully within the next sort of 6 to 12 months that should appear. However, in the meantime, we need to make sure that we apply the following when we're defining CCP. So what we have to consider is, if a control measure cannot be used at a step to control a significant hazard, then it's not a CCP. In addition, if a control measure can be used at a later step, or there's another control measure, then the step again is not a CCP. And where a control measure at a step is used in combination or with other control measures at another step, then it is a CCP. So really what it's sort of saying is it's taking the elements that were familiar to us within that original Codex decision tree, but it's not actually stipulating it in a decision tree today. And it's giving organisations the opportunity to use the decision tree, or indeed use another method that they feel comfortable with. And some organisations have at this moment in time decided to keep the original decision tree, and there's nothing wrong with that in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide gives us a summary of the changes in the definitions, and also highlights the new definitions. So if we sort of start at the top, so validation has been removed and been replaced with validation of control measure. So that is definitely worth a read, and looking at that, how that relates into both chapters 1 and chapters 2. Verification has been changed to the application of methods, and procedures and tests and other evaluation, in addition to monitoring to determine whether a control measure is operating as intended. So again, we can see that that has been broadened and is a little bit more prescriptive than the previous definition. And going through the new definition, so we have a definition of acceptable level, which is deemed a level which a hazard is below is considered to be safe. So again, if we're working with GFSI standards, this type of terminology probably is very familiar. Allergen cross contact, so the unintentional incorporation of an allergen or food ingredient into another that is not intended to contain that allergen. It talks about a competent authority, so that is the government or any other authorised official body that might be enforcing food safety. Contaminant is considered to be any biological, chemical, physical agent, foreign matter, or other substance not intentionally added to the food that may compromise the food safety or the food suitability. So here I think we can sort of start to see that this might move into the arena of food fraud or food vulnerability, for example. Contamination, this is the introduction or the occurrence of the contaminant in the food or the environment. The food business operator is the entity who is responsible for operating the food business at any step of the food chain. It talks about a food hygiene system. So this is all the prerequisite programs that are supplemented with control measures at critical control points. So when taken as a whole, both the prerequisites and the critical control systems ensure that the food is suitable and will meet its intended use. There is a lot of work on good hygiene practices within this framework, and it describes good hygiene practices as those fundamental measures and conditions, when applied at a step within the food chain, provide safe and suitable food. So this definition really highlights the importance of good hygiene practices in the management of food safety. And when you read through the document, you will really sort of see how that has been pulled out and extended. Prerequisites in programs, it still talks about prerequisite programs in chapter 2, but the definition of a prerequisite program includes the good hygiene practices, the good manufacturing practices and so forth, as well as other practices and procedures such as training and traceability that establish the basic environmental and operating conditions. I think it's worth noting that the chapter 1 provides a comprehensive requirement for good hygiene practices, and chapter 2 acknowledges them as part of the prerequisite programs. And it also highlights, as in previous versions, that prerequisites are definitely the foundation for an effective HACCP system. And lastly, the significant hazard. So a hazard that's identified by hazard analysis, which is reasonably likely to occur at an unacceptable level in the absence of control. So it's essential to give, it's there to give the food the safety requirement to meet the intended use of the food. Next slide, please. So yeah, good hygiene practices in HACCP. As I've sort of said, that chapter 1 details the good hygiene practices, and it can be seen there's some significant changes here and a real sort of change from the 2003 version. As I've just highlighted, that good hygiene practices are the foundation to any food safety management system, and they're in practically everything that we do in our day-to-day jobs. And the purpose of this is to provide conditions and activities to support the production of safe and suitable food at all stages through the food chain. However, in the 2020 version, the food business operator must have knowledge of the production processes and the hazards which could have the potential to contaminate products. And additionally, there needs to be an understanding of these control measures and an understanding of how to manage these hazards within the business. So in simple terms, really what it's sort of saying here in the standard is that can these good hygiene practices, when applied, be capable of, or are they sufficient to manage hazards within the business? So here it's implying a great deal of knowledge is actually needed by the food business operator, which may present some challenges for some smaller organisation. It also then goes on to say that this really needs to be demonstrated through scientifically valid information. So we need to demonstrate that through information such as microbiological specifications, our time and temperature control, so our cooking, our cooling, for example, our allergen management, and our cleaning protocols. So here I think we can sort of see that that is going to be a bigger challenge for smaller businesses, but it acknowledges that this can actually be pulled in through external expertise if the resources are not within the business today. So the food business operator must be capable of knowing when hazards occur are present, that they are the good hygiene practices that we've got in place are sufficient to produce the safe food, and that a combination of control measures may need to be applied at different steps in the process to prevent or reduce hazards to an acceptable level. So it really is about the food business operator having that knowledge to know which hygiene practices are appropriate to them and which hygiene practices are going to control the hazards within their business. So using the good hygiene practices, it is possible, and there's provision within the Codex framework, that some businesses may just decide that good hygiene practices on their own are sufficient to control the food hazards within their business. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's part of the flexibility that's been brought into this framework. However, some businesses might be more complex, and managing the food safety without applying critical control points may not be suitable. So, you know, when we're thinking about businesses that may want to control or their food safety through good hygiene practices, it might be somebody who's growing and selling fresh produce for further processing, but something that's sort of more complicated, such as canning or retort products, you know, we may actually want to consider using the CCPs to support the good hygiene practices to control the hazards within the business. So really the intention here is that you know, the one size fits all approach has been applied, but I'd say use it with caution, because specialized technical knowledge is still needed to understand those food safety hazards and understand, can they really be controlled? Next slide, please. So I think it's worth noting that whilst there was a lot of talk about the detail and the types of good hygiene practices that we have all through chapter 1, in section 7 of chapter 1, in section 7.1.3, it lays down requirements for considering the effectiveness of good hygiene practices. So it states here that the food business operator needs to use all available information to consider if the good hygiene practice is capable of controlling the hazard. For example, you know, it might be contact surfaces might need more frequent cleaning to prevent build-up if we're making sandwiches, for example. And is this and understanding, is this a sufficient step, and can it really be managed by good hygiene practice? And if not, then that's when it becomes necessary to implement HACCP. In section 7.2 of chapter 1, it also states that things like time and temperature control, such as cooking, and specific processes such as drying, cooling, and so forth, whilst they can be considered as good hygiene practices, it also recognises that these steps again could be CCPs in HACCP, for example, pasteurisation, sterilisation, and so forth. But essentially, it's leaving it up to the business to decide whether they feel that the good hygiene practices are enough, or whether they actually feel that CCPs do need to be pulled in to manage those hazards. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide really gives us a basic summary of the key changes to those good hygiene practices, and really they are as follows. So it talks about primary production. So this now includes addition of water suitability. It goes on to move into establishment of design, facilities, and equipment. So this is where it details more robust controls for contamination and cross-contamination for design and layout. As mentioned earlier, the emphasis around training and competence. So there is now a requirement for adequate hygiene training, but this has also been extended to people who don't necessarily consider themselves as food handlers, such as maintenance staff, and specifically training on the use of maintenance of equipment and instruments that we might be using for measuring. There is also a general awareness requirement, so that people actually understand the impact of the task that they're doing on food safety. And again, the code sort of lists suggested training topics that we could consider as part of our training programs. Establishment maintenance, cleaning and disinfection. There is again more robust requirements around there in terms of verification and so forth. And again, that links into the prevention of contamination and cross-contamination and allergen management. This also then pulls into areas such as pest control, again, which is worth a read because again, it's around the verification aspects there. Control and waste management, so these have been added, and there are much more detailed requirements for this than we would have seen in the 2003 version. Personal hygiene, so more detail has been added on awareness of personnel and the importance of personal hygiene, wound care, personal cleanliness, personal behaviours, and also with an emphasis on instruction and of supervision of people who might be visiting our site, so people like contractors and so forth. There is a section on control of operations, so that's all around product description, product process, and consideration to the effectiveness of good hygiene practices. And it also brings out the monitoring and corrective action and verification. Product information and consumer education. This section has been enhanced with the purpose of enabling consumers to understand the importance of any product label information. So essentially what it's sort of saying here is, am I giving the customer or the consumer enough information to make an informed decision in whether that product is suitable for me, and also have I given the consumer enough information in terms of handling that product so that when they are consuming that product, it is indeed safe. And lastly, loss identification and traceability. A requirement for this has now been added, and the purpose around that is to enable an effective recall. So I think we can probably sort of see that there's been a number of updates on the key aspects of those good hygiene practices around physical, chemical contamination, recalls, microbiological, physical and allergen specifications. But I'd really sort of recommend that this is read. Even though many of those things would seem very, very familiar to people who have already pulled in GFSI requirements into their business, there are some strong similarities. Again, there are some very, very subtle changes that you might want to pull in and read and be aware of. Next slide, please. So now we're going to leave chapter 1 behind, and we're going to jump into chapter 2, where we're going to talk about those changes in the HACCP principles. So as I've said, the HACCP now has its own chapter, and in that chapter, it is broken down into preliminary steps and also the HACCP principles. So I think it's worth noting there's been some changes, and what I've tried to do here in the presentation is to put those changes in italics so that you can absolutely see those quite clearly, and also see how it sort of compares to what the framework that you're previously used to. So in the preliminary steps, we've got changes in steps 1 and step 3. So in step 1, we're talking about assembling the HACCP team and identifying the scope. So there's now a need to define where the HACCP study starts and where it ends, and what it includes. Step number 3 is to construct a flow diagram detailing raw materials, ingredients, processing aids, packaging, utilities, any rework or waste or byproducts, and those all need to be included on that process flow diagram. And again, so those of you who are working with those GFSI standards, that's probably something that you have included already. Next slide, please. So for the HACCP principles, I've done the same. I've included the changes in italics. So if we're jumping into principle 1, so we're talking about conducting hazard analysis and identifying control measures and considering the intended use and any known intended use. So the focus here is on intended use and unintended use. So we need to consider how the consumer will handle and consume the product. So for example, they may consume cookie dough that's raw, and that could potentially have raw egg in it, which could present as a salmonella hazard. Or, as I'm rather guilty of, is consuming frozen vegetables without cooking. Again, this could present something that's like a listeria hazard, both of which, you know, are a potential hazard. But simply putting cooking instructions on the packaging is not sufficient. We really need to understand the intended use as in our hazard analysis, and put in the steps to control those hazards. So principle 3. So we're talking about establishing validated critical limits, and critical limits are to be both measurable, observable, and they need to be validated to obtain evidence that they are capable of controlling the hazards. So the food business operator can complete the validation themselves, or they could use literature that's scientifically valid. They could use regulations, guidance. They could use scientifically valid time and temperature curves, or they could take guidance from competent authorities. So whilst we're requiring validated critical limits, we're not saying that they have to be validated by the food business operator themselves, again, giving that element of flexibility. So principle 6, validation of the HACCP plan and verification procedures. So really what it's sort of saying here is, before you produce anything, you need to validate your HACCP plan. Through doing this, what are we doing? So we're ensuring that all elements of our HACCP plan are coming together here. So have I identified the correct hazards? Are my CCPs correct? Will my critical limits control the hazard? Is frequency and monitoring sufficient to pick up the problem before products leave the premises? Are my corrective actions robust enough? Will they get to the root cause? Will they stop the problem from reoccurring? And also considering things like the frequency and the type of validation and the information that we're recording. You know, does that really show that our food safety plan is working and delivering safe food? So before everybody sort of jumps out here and thinks, oh my goodness, I've got to revalidate my HACCP plan under this new framework, existing HACCP plans will not need revalidating, because you will be able to demonstrate that through your historical data that you have collected. However, for all new products and processes, this will need to be considered, and they will need to pull through on a validation for those. Next slide, please. So finally, we move on to allergen management, and this is our last topic in the webinar. So there's now a new requirement to control allergens in addition to the physical, chemical, and biological hazards. So the requirements on allergen management are referred to as the Code of Practice of Food Allergen Management for Food Business Operators, and I've highlighted the reference number there. It's worth saying that this is a standalone document and can be used side by side with the good hygiene principles. So it does sort of pull through and sit quite nicely with that. And the areas are comprehensive, of course, because it's a new requirement, and it really sort of pulls in on identification of allergens in raw materials. So it's requiring us to have robust specifications and understanding what allergens are present within the materials that we're purchasing. It focuses around cross-contamination, so we're talking about segregation, cleaning, handling, and so forth. It focuses in very strongly around allergen awareness and allergen training, and also labeling to provide allergen information to customers and consumers to make those those informed decisions. I would definitely say obtain a copy of this and have a read. And I think for those of you, again, whilst if you're working with GFSI standards, I think you'll find it's very, very closely aligned with what you're working with already. Next slide, please. So yeah, I thought I'd pull together sort of some of my final thoughts, really. So I've tried to give you a bit of an overview today of the main changes in the Codex Alimentarius 2020 update for the general principles of food hygiene. And absolutely, I have not covered everything in full. I've just really pulled out the headlines of the changes. It can be seen, I think, very much so that the 2020 version has moved on significantly since the last update in 2003. And it includes some minor changes and updates, and also there's there's some things in there that have been brought in that maybe we're considered to be common practices now, particularly in lot identification and traceability. But you know, as I sort of said, as all the way through, those of you who are working with GFSI standards will be much more comfortable with that content. I think the element of flexibility is important to recognise that you can manage food safety through good hygiene practices. And again, that might apply to businesses that are smaller or less complex or less complex. So in short, really those changes include a requirement for a food safety culture. Definitions have been revised and updated, so they're definitely worth a read. There was enhanced training requirements that focuses in around competence. I think it would definitely say there's been enhanced good hygiene system requirements and good hygiene practice requirements for the control of operations too. New allergen management controls that weren't sitting in the 2003 version, and a requirement for traceability. There's also enhanced consumer education requirements to allow consumers to make informed decisions about the food they're buying, in particular to allergen that might be present, and also to handle and to store that product to ensure that when they consume that product is safe. And also lastly, the changes around the HACCP principles and the requirement for validation of the HACCP plan. So yeah, all of these requirements, you know, are sitting in the Codex and the World Health Organization website. And I'd strongly recommend that you download a copy of the Good Hygiene Practices and the Food Allergen Management Code, really to sort of go through some of those areas that you may have find are of interest to you and your business. So that really concludes our session today, and I'd really like to thank you for listening. And I hope that you've both enjoyed and found the webinar useful. And I think now we'll just quickly move into the Q&A session. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Caroline. We've had a few questions come in, so I'll just start at the top. What's the deadline for implementing these changes?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. There is no deadline for implementing the changes. So unlike for working with the GFSI standard, we sit there and we say it's got to be implemented by X. This is now published, and the thought process is that this should be incorporated within a business. So if you are working with your local authority, and your local authority is in the particularly within England, who is enforcing HACCP with you within your food business, then the expectation is that you should have picked up this code and you should be working towards this. And it might be something that you might want to be sort of working with your local authority over if you have that relationship. But again, no deadline. The expectation is that it's published and you should be working towards that.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Is there a document that outlines these changes from the last version?
Unfortunately, no. I'm afraid it doesn't. So I think it really does come down to you having a read. But if you've attended this morning, you've probably got the main highlighted areas of it. So hopefully I've pointed out the key changes to you. I definitely sit there and say, read chapter 1 and go through the good hygiene practices, have a look at the definitions, and really think about how you're going to apply those preliminary steps and also the changes in the HACCP principles. So yeah, no easy answer, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Caroline. How do I know what the unintentional use may be for a product? Yeah,
that's another great question. Yeah, there's no guidance on that, and I think that really sort of comes down to you as a business and your HACCP team, and really sort of considering what could go wrong and what you know, and really probably putting yourself in the shoes of the consumer, and really sort of understanding what they could do. Like for example, eating raw cookie dough, I personally can't imagine anything awful, but as I understand it, it's a trend to do that. So I think it's really looking at what the consumer could do and what's reasonable, and also say documenting it as well, so that you're very, very clear on that unintended use and what it is that you're trying to control.
Fantastic. How do I know if someone's competent?
Well, that's another great question. Yeah, I think we don't like to talk about the reverse of that either. But there's many ways you could do that. I think you could do that through interviewing that person, sort of, tell me, talk me about it. Why are you doing it? I think really what you're trying to do, the element of it, what you're trying to do through the competence is people understanding the impacts of their own behaviours and their own tasks on food safety of the business. So you could do that through talking to people, questions and answers, observing people, or you could simply do it through a little written test if you wanted to do. And obviously your verification should pull out any issues that you are seeing around competence very quickly. But it is a tough one to sort of call, and finding it at the right level. And it depends on the skills and the knowledge, staff turnover that you have within your organisation.
Brilliant. Cheers, Caroline. We've got another one here about training. Can SGS help with training on HACCP? Certainly
can. Yeah, I have written three levels of HACCP, and I've actually aligned it with these new requirements. So we were going right down to sort of like the basic introductory level HACCP training that we've got for people who are new into an organisation, and also we've got the level 2 for supervisors and level 3 for managers and HACCP team members and also supervisors who want to progress. That aside, if you want to get in touch, we can provide bespoke training for you as well, if you need. So yeah, something very much we can do.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. Right, that's all the questions we've had. So I'd like to thank all our attendees today. Thank you all very much for joining. And thank you, Caroline, for presenting and answering those questions. If you need to contact us, our email address is ukacademy@sgs.com, or you can call us on 01276 697 777. And you'll also find us on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So I hope you've all enjoyed this webinar. I'll get a copy of the slides and the recording sent out to you all next week. And we hope we can see you soon. Thank you very much, guys.